The Essex Conspiracy. In 1601, 6 months before the Hamlet was staged on the stage of the Globe Theatre, an uprising in London was raised and suppressed by Count Essex and his supporters. Numerous documents have been preserved that depict this event, and on the whole we can restore its picture, which is of multilateral interest for us. Firstly, we are in touch with the living facts of the era of interest to us. Secondly, Shakespeare was a witness of these facts. His play, Richard II, was, as we shall see, even used by the participants in the mutiny. In the latter it took the most active part of the former, patron of Shakespeare, Earl of Southampton. Some researchers believe that there is a direct link between the Essex Rebellion and Shakespeare's Hamlet, where the murder of the king is depicted. This assumption seems to us very doubtful. It is much more likely that the general atmosphere in which Essex's conspiracy ripened was reflected in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. For example, the famous modern English Shakespearean Dover Wilson, at the beginning of his edition of the text of Hamlet, silently, without any comment, placed a portrait of the Earl of Essex. The Earl of Essex. In February 1601, Count Essex, the favorite of Queen Elizabeth, raised an insurrection against her. In the heart of the Earl of Essex, a man of meditative and melancholy, anger had been boiling for a long time. He was indignant at the royal throne crowded numerous times, who seized the monopolies in their hands, squeezed the last of the people from the people and became fat on people's poverty. It was infuriated by him and the fact that people from all the gaps were new and unfamiliar. Upstarts, as he called them, the only virtue of which was the ability to stuff pockets with any means. Their very entrepreneuriality was hated by him. And the Earl of Essex, in the circle of close people, liked to talk about the time when English kings, every little fry, did not even receive a glance and consulted with people of noble, generous, genuine chivalrous honor worthy. Count d'Essex honored himself with such a worthy, true chivalrous honor as a hero. The brilliant victories of the Earl of Essex, who commanded the English fleet, over the Spaniards created him national glory. A typical upstart is, for example, Osric in Hamlet. For Spain, which was at that time the greatest empire in the world, England's growing maritime power was becoming a threat. Spain owned fabulous in wealth colonies of the New World, where from time to time came to the Spanish ports ships with precious cargo of gold sand and gold bars. Have never seen such a quantity of gold in Europe. But the waters of the Atlantic Ocean were plowed by lungs, agile, like bloodhounds, ships of English pirates. The British government not only formally authorized English pirates to rob Spanish merchant ships, but even encouraged it. One of these pirates, the illustrious Francis Drake, was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, after which he became known as Sir Francis Drake. The very sight of their overseas possessions is not today. Tomorrow the colonies of the British could grow up. It was necessary as soon as possible to destroy a dangerous rival, and in 1588, His Catholic Majesty, the King of Spain, Philip II, equipped an unparalleled squadron of the largest magnitude, planted a mighty army on the ships and sent them against England. The Spaniards boasted that they are doing God's work. They are going to force the English back into the bosom of a true Catholic Church, to permanently destroy the accursed Protestant heresy in England. A terrible threat looms over the English people. The huge fleet, the so-called Invincible Armada, was slowly approaching England. From day to day in the cities and villages of the British Island people expected news about the landing of the Spaniards. In that era, the earliest courier was the fastest means of communication, but riding couriers though, and it was given to them before sending the following edification: "Hurry, hurry. In the name of your life, hurry," did not always keep up with the time. And here in especially urgent cases resorted to the following method. On the tops of the hills were stacked heaps of brushwood. They will see that smoke appeared on a nearby hill or a fire flashed in the night, and they themselves would light a fire. The same thing is repeated on a nearby hill, and the fiery news from the coast will fly to the very heart of the country. Day after day, night after night, expecting in England that the signal fire will light up, informing the fatal news of the landing of the Spanish troops. But the fires did not light up. Gale of Elizabeth. Vanguard of the Invincible Armada met with the British advanced squadron, commanded by Francis Drake. Light British ships went on the attack and proved their superiority over the heavy, slow Spanish spree. The vanguard of the Invincible Armada was defeated. But this battle had not yet settled the matter. It was decided by a storm, partly sank, partly swept and maimed by the Spanish ships. Favorable for landing, the moment was irretrievably lost by the Spaniards. England was saved. A few years later, and the British went on the offensive. Their squadron under the command of Count Essex won 2 brilliant victories over the Spaniards. The glory of England, you, whose name went like thunder, all over Spain, made you terrified. The beautiful branch on the tree of honor, the color of knighthood, rejoice in your noble victory, the famous English poet Edmund Spenser sang to Essex. Fate was smiling at the young nobleman. Queen Elizabeth favored him. But Elizabeth never put her personal feelings first. And when it came to her, information met in the palace of the Count of Essex in the evenings. His friends gather and, sitting down by the wall, on which was painted a large rose, a symbol of silence and observance of secrecy, lead their rebellious speeches. She, no one without speaking a word, took action. In 1599 a rebellion broke out in Ireland, the more dangerous that Iceland remained a Catholic country and could easily have conspired with Spain to her. The Count of Essex was appointed ruler of Ireland. Honorable appointment, but in fact it was his equivalent to a lank. In English, and now there is the expression, under the rose, that is, secretly, in secret. On March 27, 1599, the Earl of Essex drove from London. Surrounded by a brilliant retinue, the enamored Count himself drove through the streets of the capital. Next to him, his relative and young friend Earl Southampton pawed on horseback. Another great popularity among the people was the winner of the Spaniards, and a lot of people sent to the streets, escorting the Earl of Essex. Cries were heard, "God bless you!" This was told by eyewitnesses. Among them, it seems, was William Shakespeare. In 1599, he wrote for the theatre a historical and patriotic play about the English King Henry V, who was in the 15th century, the victor of the French. In the prologue, the so-called chorus to the last act of Henry V, Shakespeare mentions the solemn departure of the Earl of Essex, which was escorted not only by the Lord Mayor and City Councillors of London, but also by swarming crowds of the common people. And he wished the Earl of Essex to return to London, bearing a revolt pierced by him, on the edge of the sword. In order to control the rebellious Ireland, it was necessary first of all to be a politician. And the politician Count Essex was not. He was burdened by the fact that he had to live in this accursed Irish hole, far from the royal court. He was also tormented by the knowledge that his enemies did not tire of blackening him in the eyes of the Queen, taking advantage of his absence. Count Essex showed complete inaction in Ireland, for which he was summoned to London and in August 1600 was tried. He was deprived of all his posts and was forced to return to private life. Then he decided to act by force. In the first days of February 1601, so showed a comrade later in the trial, Shakespeare on stage, actor Augustine Phillips, Sir Charles Percy, Sir Jocelyn Percy and Lord Monteagle, all three were friends of Essex, appeared at the Globe Theatre. These noble gentlemen asked the actors to put on February 7 the play, Richard II, by Shakespeare. The actors began to talk out. The play is an old one, it was written by Shakespeare back in 1595, it has not gone for a long time and will not do the fees. But the notable gentleman promised the actors £10, and the actors, having thought, agreed to resume the play with 1 or 2 rehearsals. It never occurred to them that they were conspirators who wanted to use Shakespeare's Richard II as an agitation play, for in this play it is told about the overthrow of the king from the throne. On February 7th, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, having had dinner and drinking wine, several conspirators came to the performance at the Globus Theatre. They sat down in a box, watching from there the impressions that the play produced on the audience, and when the actors approached the time of the overthrow of King Richard from the throne, they began to express their approval with noisy cries and applause. The simple spectators standing at the bottom of the theater's stage looked at these gentlemen with bewilderment, who behaved so strangely. The next day everything was explained. It was Sunday, February 8, 1601. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the Earl of Essex, Earl of Southampton, Count Rutland, Earl of Bedford, and with them, as the document of that era testifies, up to 60 men of knights and other gentlemen of noble blood went out into the street. They went to the center of the city and unfurled a banner with the emblem of the Counts of Essex. "We, the townspeople of London, follow us," they shouted. "Take the birdice, the cudgels, everything will come in handy." Elizabeth's death. But the townspeople of London remained deaf to the rebellious appeal. They knew that the overthrow of the Queen threatened them with untold calamities. The power will be seized by noble lords, they will divide the country among themselves, they will start to fight with each other for domination, as they fought in the old days. Trade, there will be a great ruin. And then surely the Spaniards will come, take the country with their bare hands, crash the rubbish, house and blood-created state, and they become slaves to strangers. Woe to the country where the kings are imprisoned and where the lords rule. So it was said in the historical tragedy of Marlowe, King Edward I, which even 10 years before the events described by us played in one of the London theaters. In the windows flashed amazed gloomy faces, shutters shuddered with the noise. On the extinct street there were conspirators. The crowd soon began to thin out. Many of them, realizing the failure, were rescued as best they could. And suddenly, somewhere on the next street, a drum was hammered. It was the Queen's soldiers who had been sent to suppress the rebellion. The conspirators ran into the palace of the Earl of Essex and locked the soldiers of the Queen besieged the palace from all sides. The conspirators for a long time did not give up. They threatened with swords from the windows of the palace, shouted something and covered themselves with small round shields with a soldier from the French, pistols. The hopelessness of their situation was, however, and in there was a young Count Southampton on the roof of the palace a tall, slender, with a waist, dressed in a magnificent velvet jacket, he began to rollize on the roof, casually playing with his sword. Then he stopped, his arms akimbo, and shouted to the lower-ranking officers of the Queen, yielding to strength, he and his friends are ready to surrender. The trial began. The Earl of Essex and many others laid their heads on the scaffold. Earl Southampton was also sentenced to death, which was replaced by imprisonment in the Tower, where he stayed for 2 years, until the death of Elizabeth and the accession of King James I. They summoned the actors of the Globe, including, probably, William Shakespeare. But it turned out that the author's participation in the plot was involuntary, without any intent on their part. It did not occur to them that the noble gentleman who ordered the performance pursued a secret goal. The actors were released. The storm passed by Shakespeare. Many people talked about this event in London. It was said that once the Queen gave her beloved Essex a ring, as a pledge of what would fulfill any of his wishes. On the eve of the execution, Count Essex allegedly asked one of his relatives, who came to him to say goodbye, to hand over the ring to the Queen. But this court lady, on frivolity or out of fear, gave the ring to one of the ministers, who hid it. Others said that the Queen's face quivered and that tears came before her eyes when she signed the death sentence to Essex. But all this was just rumors. From the outside, Elizabeth remained perfectly calm. On the eve of the execution of Essex and the main conspirators, she ordered the actors of the Globe, among which was probably Shakespeare, to come to the palace and entertain her with a performance. And the next morning, on February 24, 1601, during the execution of the execution, the Queen calmly played in her bedchamber at the clavichord. Yet the Queen was touched by the fact that she was dared to compare with the reckless Richard II. "Do not you know who I am?" She could not resist. She said with a grin to the head of the tower, "I am Richard II." Thus ended the most noisy event in the political life of England in 1601, the same year in which, in August, Hamlet was staged on the London stage. Queen Elizabeth. Portrait of the artist V. Rogers. How did Shakespeare treat Essex's conspiracy? He sympathized with what the citizens of London thought. In his historical chronicle, Henry IV, Shakespeare, as we have seen, condemned the feudal lords, who rebelled against the king in the name of their ancient rights and privileges. In this best of Shakespeare's historical plays, written in 1597, there is a scene in which rebellious feudal lords, bending over the map, anticipate the victory and already divide the country among themselves. Like all progressive people of his time, Shakespeare was on the side of the monarchy in her struggle against those great lords who dreamed of returning the country to feudal antiquity. This is evidenced by the famous monologue of Ulysses in Shakespeare's play, Troilus and Cressida, written in 1602. In this monologue, Shakespeare compares the monarch to the sun. The sun will fall from the sky, the willful planets will begin to wander on a whim, and great ones will come to calamities for the whole people. In the same year 1601 another, less noisy, but no less significant event occurred in the political life of England. Parliament, in which the influence of the Puritans, this avant-garde of the growing bourgeoisie became stronger, broke off sharply for the first time with the Queen's government. There was a sort of thunderous roll of thunder, the first harbinger of a distant, slowly approaching thunderstorm, the English bourgeois revolution that broke out 50 years later and in 1649 forced King Charles I to lay down on the block. But just in those troubled years with which the 17th century began, in those years when, as we have already said, tragic themes began to prevail in Shakespeare's work, from the outside, the life of the great playwright seems, judging by the information that has come down to us, especially calm and prosperous.